My husband, I miss you so much. The kids are asking questions.
You came to this family empty. You will go back empty.
She held her husband in her arms and watched him take his final breath. No one told her that grief could come with betrayal. They buried him and buried the truth with him. But what they didn't know is that she would rise. This is the story of a woman who lost everything, her husband, her home, her hope, until she found a secret that changed everything. Stay with me till the end, because what happens next will break your heart and build your faith. Grace sat on the hospital floor, holding her husband Samuel close. His body was cold and weak, and his breathing was slow. The nurses tried to help, but Samuel was slipping away. His eyes were filled with tears as he looked at Grace for the last time. With a soft voice, he said, "Protect the children and forgive them." Then his eyes closed, and he stopped breathing. Grace shouted his name, but there was no reply. The heart monitor made a long, loud sound. A nurse came and gently tried to take her hands off his body, but she held on tighter, crying loudly. Everything around her became quiet, like the world had stopped. Outside the hospital, rain started falling. Grace stood in the rain, still crying, still shaking. Her heart was broken. Samuel, her best friend and the father of her children, had died in her arms. She felt lost. The house was quiet, too quiet. Grace looked at the bed she used to share with Samuel, and now it felt big and empty. She sat on the edge, staring at his pillow. Titi, her 8-year-old daughter, walked in and asked, "Is Daddy still sleeping?" Grace couldn't speak. She simply hugged her tight and wiped her tears. Junior, only 5 years old, didn't understand what was happening. He followed Grace everywhere, holding her wrapper and asking for his daddy. Grace tried to stay strong, but inside, she felt like she was breaking. The food was almost finished, and the rent was due. That morning, the landlord knocked on the door with a paper in his hand. It was an eviction notice. Grace stood there, speechless. He said she had only 2 weeks to leave. As she closed the door, she looked around her home and whispered, "How do I do this alone?" The day of the burial came. People gathered, sang hymns, and cried. Grace stood near Samuel's coffin, holding her children's hands. Her heart was heavy, and her eyes were swollen from crying all night. Mama Nkechi, Samuel's mother, cried the loudest, but Grace noticed something in her eyes. It wasn't just pain, it was anger. After the burial, when everyone left, Mama Nkechi pulled Grace aside. Her face changed. "You brought my son nothing but trouble," she said harshly. "He's dead because of you. Don't expect anything from this family." Grace was shocked. She couldn't believe it. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. Her hands shook. How could the woman who raised the man she loved say such cruel words? Grace walked away slowly, holding back tears. The same family she had cared for now turned their backs on her when she needed them the most. Grace sat on the floor with a box of Samuel's old documents. She wanted to hold on to anything that reminded her of him. Inside the box, she saw something that made her heart skip, a brown envelope with her name on it. With shaky hands, she opened it. What she found inside made her feel sick. It was a hospital bill. Samuel had taken a loan to pay for his treatments, and the papers showed he still owed more than $3 million. There were red stamps on them: final warning, pay now, last notice. Tears filled her eyes. He never told her. He had been smiling and trying to be strong while carrying this heavy burden alone. She whispered, "Why didn't you tell me, Samuel?" Now, not only was he gone, but he had left behind a huge debt. Grace felt like she was drowning, and there was no one to save her. 2 weeks passed quickly. One morning, the landlord came with 2 men. He didn't knock, he just entered the small house and pointed to their things. "Pack everything. Your time is up," he said. Grace begged. "Please, give me just 1 more week. I have children." But he shook his head. Business is business. Soon, their clothes, pots, and toys were outside. Titi cried and asked, "Mummy, are we going to sleep on the road?" Grace said nothing. She tied Junior to her back and carried 2 bags with one hand, holding Titi's hand with the other. They walked slowly on the street, with no place to go. People watched from their windows. Some whispered, some looked away. No one offered help. Grace's legs were weak, but she kept walking. She didn't know where they were going. She only knew she had to protect her children. That was all she had left. That night, Grace took the children to a church not far from the street. The gate was open. The place was empty and quiet. She sat on a wooden bench and placed Junior on her lap. Titi curled up beside her, using her wrapper as a blanket. Her stomach growled. The children were hungry, but all she had was a small piece of bread in her bag. She broke it in 2 and gave it to them. "Eat, my darlings," she whispered. They didn't complain. They just ate and laid down to sleep. An old usher saw them and brought a bottle of water. He didn't say much, but his eyes were kind. Grace thanked him softly. That night, as the wind blew through the open windows, Grace looked up and prayed with tears in her eyes. "God, if you can hear me, please say something. I need you." But there was silence. The next morning, Grace stood outside the church with tired eyes and a heavy heart. Titi had a slight fever, and Junior kept coughing. She didn't know where to go. Just then, a black car stopped in front of the church gate. The window rolled down, and a woman inside gasped, "Grace, is that you?" It was Zainab, her old friend from university. They hadn't spoken in years. Zainab looked elegant, dressed in fine clothes with her makeup done perfectly. Grace looked down at her torn wrapper and dusty slippers. To all my subscribers, thank you for supporting stories that truly matter. Your love keeps this channel going. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button now and turn on the bell so you don't miss any of our powerful stories. Now, let's begin. Without asking too many questions, Zainab helped her into the car and took her to her home in Lekki. The house was big and beautiful, nothing like where Grace had lived. Zainab gave her food and a room to stay in for a while. But even though Grace was thankful, she noticed something. Zainab's kindness came with small comments that hurt. "You used to be so smart. What happened to you?" Grace forced a smile, but inside, she felt like a beggar. One quiet night, when the children were asleep, Grace sat on the floor with one of Samuel's old bags. She had not gone through it before. As she unzipped it, she found his leather journal, the one he always carried with him. She opened it slowly. The first page had his handwriting. She smiled sadly. But what caught her attention was a folded letter hidden inside. She opened it, and her heart stopped. Samuel had written about a man named Elder Benson. He had been offered money to stay quiet about a bad land deal at church, but he refused. The letter explained how Samuel had been threatened many times after that. He said in the note, "I chose what's right, even though it hurts us. If anything happens to me, this man knows why." Grace's hands shook. She realized her husband may not have just died from sickness. Something else had happened, something dark. The next day, Grace went to the church to find out more about Elder Benson. He was a respected man, tall, proud, and powerful. Everyone greeted him with respect. But when Grace walked up to him and mentioned Samuel, His face changed for a second. She said softly, "You knew my husband, didn't you?" He smiled coldly. "Yes, I knew him. A good man, but too stubborn," she replied. "He said you hurt him. He left proof." He looked into her eyes and said in a low voice, "You should be careful with what you say. You're just a widow. You don't want to make trouble." Grace's heart raced. She now knew the truth. Samuel had stood up for justice, and this man had tried to silence him. She walked away quickly, but her hands were shaking. She whispered to herself, "I won't let him get away with this. I'll fight for Samuel." Grace didn't sleep that night. She kept hearing Elder Benson's voice in her head, warning her to stay quiet. But instead of fear, something strong began to rise inside her: anger, courage, and the desire to get justice for Samuel. The next morning, she wore her cleanest clothes and tied her scarf properly. She looked at herself in the mirror and said, "Samuel died with truth in his mouth. I will not let that truth die with him." She walked to Elder Benson's house, a big, beautiful mansion with high fences and a security guard at the gate. The guard laughed when she said she had no appointment, but she insisted until they let her in. Elder Benson came out, shocked to see her standing in front of his marble steps. She looked him in the eye and said, "I know what you did." But he laughed and said, "Go home, widow. You can't win against me." Grace walked away, but she knew she had just started. Back at Zainab's house, Grace told her everything. Zainab was quiet for a moment, then said, "I know someone who can help you. He's a young lawyer, fresh out of law school. He may not be famous, but he's sharp." That evening, she introduced Grace to Barrister James. He looked about 28 years old, clean-cut and serious. When Grace explained Samuel's death and the letter in the journal, James leaned forward, listening carefully. After she finished, he looked her in the eye and said, "This case is big, but I believe you. If your husband was poisoned or silenced, we need to prove it. I'll help you for free." Grace was surprised. "Why?" she asked. He smiled and replied, "My mother was a widow too. I saw what the world did to her. Let's fight this together." For the first time in weeks, Grace felt like someone was finally on her side. Within days, Barrister James filed a case. He added the journal as evidence and requested a full investigation into Samuel's death. It quickly caught people's attention. The story of the brave widow and her late husband who stood for truth began spreading across blogs and social media. At the first court hearing, Grace stood beside James. Her palms were sweaty, and her heart beat fast. Elder Benson walked in with expensive lawyers and a proud look on his face. He didn't even glance at Grace. In court, James spoke with confidence. He read parts of Samuel's journal aloud. People in the room gasped. Benson's lawyer tried to make Grace look like a bitter widow who wanted money. Then came the biggest shock. When they asked the hospital for Samuel's full medical file, it was missing. Grace's mouth opened in surprise. Samuel's file had been wiped from the system. Something was very wrong. A few days after the court session, Grace was sitting in a corner of the courtroom building when a young woman walked up to her quietly. She wore a nurse's uniform and looked nervous. She said, "Are you Mrs. Grace?" Grace stood up slowly and said yes. The woman whispered, "I was on duty the night your husband passed away. I saw something, and I need to talk." Later that day, in a private meeting with Barrister James, the nurse explained everything. She said, a strange man visited Samuel's room the night before he died and changed one of his IV bags. She had written a report about it, but the hospital told her to keep quiet. Grace felt cold all over. This proved that Samuel didn't just die of sickness, he was poisoned. James quickly added the nurse's statement to the case. Now, They had real proof. Everything was changing. The next court date was different. People filled the courtroom, some curious, some angry. The judge looked serious. Barrister James stood up and presented the nurse's signed statement. He also showed proof that Samuel's journal had been ignored before. Elder Benson's face lost its smile. The judge asked Elder Benson's lawyer, why was the medical file missing? The lawyer had no good answer. Then the judge called for the arrest of Elder Benson for investigation. People gasped. Grace couldn't believe it. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She held her children's hands and whispered, "Daddy, we did it." Later, the court awarded her $5 million as damages. But more than the money, it was the truth that mattered to Grace. Samuel's name was cleared. The world now knew he was a man of integrity, a man who died for standing up for what was right. And now, she could begin to heal. With the money from the court, Grace first paid off Samuel's medical debts. Then she used part of it to rent a small, neat apartment. It wasn't big, but it was theirs. Titi and Junior had their own little beds again, and they could laugh freely. Grace used the rest to start a small catering business. Samuel had always said she was a good cook, and that one day they would open a food business together. She called it Sam and Grace Foods. She started with just a few customers, mostly church people and neighbors. But they loved her food, and word spread fast. Soon, she began receiving orders from offices and events. She was finally earning something steady. Every day when she stirred the pots or packed food, she felt Samuel's spirit with her. He wasn't there physically, but his dreams were alive in everything she was building. One evening, Grace sat outside her shop and watched a young widow pass by, carrying a baby on her back and selling groundnuts. Her eyes looked tired. Grace stood up and called her. She gave her a plate of food and said, "You don't have to pay." That moment sparked something in Grace's heart. Later that week, she started something new, the Samuel Foundation. It was small at first, just a few women helping each other. She gave them food, training, and small support to start their own work. Word spread, and soon other widows and struggling mothers came. Grace gave talks, shared her story, and reminded them that pain doesn't have to be the end. "You can rise again," she always said. Through every life the foundation touched, Samuel's name lived on. His sacrifice now became hope for others. One cool evening, Grace sat outside her home, sipping wine and watching the children play. Titi laughed as Junior chased her around. The sun was going down, and a soft wind blew across the compound. She picked up Samuel's old journal again. On the last page, he had written something just before he died. It read, "If love is real, it never dies. It lives on through the ones we leave behind. Through Grace, through the children, through the truth." Grace smiled as fresh tears rolled down her face. But this time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of peace. She had done what Samuel asked. She protected the children, forgave those who wronged her, and told the truth. Samuel was gone, but his love still lived in everything she touched. And Grace was no longer broken. She had become stronger than ever. This story is a reminder that even in our deepest pain, there is purpose. Even in betrayal, there is strength. And even in loss, we can rise again. To all my loyal subscribers, thank you for always watching, liking, and sharing. Your support keeps this channel alive. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. Let's keep telling stories that heal, inspire, and teach. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never stop believing in your comeback.